Hello,
Good evening, sir.
good evening. Should we start?
हाँ सर स्टार्ट कर दियंतु.
Today we shall cover last four units of MPSE-5, Unit 13, 14, 15 and 16. Unit 13 is about deterritorialism, deterritorialization and problems of social identity. It discusses about the conceptualizing social identity of African nations, the concept of nationalism and nation, ethnicity and nationalization, independent African state from tribalism to nation building. These are important topics here in this unit. You know, Africa, Africa continent was freed from colonial rule in the 20th century, particularly from 1957, and within 1993 almost all African nations were freed from colonial rule and became independent and formed an international organization named Union of African Nations. At that time, Africa has hundreds of distinct ethnic groups. Some share common language, common history, common cultural values, common territory, common economic and political institutions. Among the known languages in the world, over 800 are spoken in Africa by hundreds of African ethnic groups. Within one country, there are several ethnic groups with different identities, and these ethnic groups are different from one to another. Along with Islam and Christianity, there are several hundreds of traditional African religions. The ethnic groups range in size from several millions, such as Hausa, the Baganda, and the Ashanti, to thousands such as Nizuma. Boundaries were drawn arbitrarily by the colonial powers. The imperial powers like Great Britain, France, Portuguese, Dutch, all those who have ruled the African countries have drawn the international boundaries of countries arbitrarily without taking the opinion of African countries into account. The boundaries were drawn arbitrarily. In East Africa, the Somalis were divided among Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. The concept of identity has become the primary medium for understanding the relationship between the personal and the social, between the individual and the group, the cultural and the political, as well as the group and the state. Although there is considerable disagreement of opposing viewpoints on these issues, most agree that question of identity is fundamental to an understanding of the process that link the individual and the personal experience to large scale cultural, social, and political process. You know, the African nations, after getting independence, were have a weak political order. The common identity among the African nations was missing. Identities can function as points of identification and gain political relevance in terms of the three to four different measures. First one is social categorization, which is the segmentation of the world so as to impose an order on the environment and provide a locus of identification for the self. Second is the social identity, which is the self concept developed out of the person's membership of a social group and the emotional value attached to that membership. Third one is the social comparison, which is the comparison of the in group characteristics with the out group characteristics. Fourth one is the psychological distinctiveness, which is the distinctive and positive group members experience in comparison to other relevant groups. These are the identity process, identification. It is about the social identity of African people, African ethnic groups. Ethnic groups, ethnic group refer to a group of people, a sizable people having either common language, common culture, common geographical area, or like that is called an ethnic group. ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ଗ୍ରୁପର ନିଜସ୍ୱ ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟି ରହିଛି। ସେଇ ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟିକୁ ନେଇ ସେମାନଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଏଥନିକ୍ ଗ୍ରୁପଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ପାର୍ଥକ୍ୟ ବହୁ ମାତ୍ରାରେ ଦେଖା ଯାଇଥାଏ। ଏହାକୁ ଓଭରକମ୍ କରିବା ପାଇଁ ଗୋଟେ ନେସନ ବିଲ୍ଡିଂ ପାଇଁ ଗୋଟେ ଦୁର୍ବଳ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ହେଇକରି ଜନ୍ମ ହେଇଥିବା ବା ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ଲାଭ କରିଥିବା ଆଫ୍ରିକାର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପରେ ସେମାନଙ୍କର ନେସନ ବିଲ୍ଡିଂ ପ୍ରୋସେସକୁ ଆଗକୁ ନବାକୁ ହେଲେ ଏଥନିକ୍ ଗ୍ରୁପର ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟିକୁ କମ୍ପ୍ରମାଇଜ କରିବାର ଆବଶ୍ୟକତା ଥିଲା। କିନ୍ତୁ ସେ ଏଥନିକ୍ ଗ୍ରୁପକୁ ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟିକୁ କମ୍ପ୍ରମାଇଜ କରି ନ୍ୟାସନାଲ ଆଟିଚ୍ୟୁଡ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲ କ୍ୟାରେକ୍ଟର ବିଲ୍ଡ କରିବା ପାଇଁ ଯେଉଁ ଦୃଢ ରାଜନୈତିକ ବ୍ୟବସ୍ଥା ଆବଶ୍ୟକ ଥିଲା ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ତାର ଅଭାବ ଥିଲା। The concept of nationalism and nation. It is difficult to define nationalism. Nationalism is a set of ideas, but as they travel from continent to continent, these ideas are of less to a theory than to rhetoric, a form of self-expression. Nationalism, ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ, nation, nationality, and nationalism. Nationalism commonly refers to a feeling within the mind of a nation, a state, or a country which builds the national attitude, national character of its people. These ideas, the feeling of nationalism ହେଲା ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ। ଏହା ଏକ ଧାରଣା, ଏହା ଏକ ଚେତନା ଯାହାକି ଗୋଟିଏ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଜନସାଧାରଣଙ୍କ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରୀୟ ଚିନ୍ତାଧାରା, ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରୀୟ ଦୃଷ୍ଟିଭଙ୍ଗୀ ସୃଷ୍ଟି କରିଥାଏ ଏବଂ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଏକତା ଅଖଣ୍ଡତାକୁ ଦୃଢ଼ ରଖିଥାଏ, ଯାହାକୁ କୁହାଯାଏ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ୍ ବା ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ। According to Ernest Haas, the most important indicator of denoting nationhood is the collective consciousness as well as the demand for independence. ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ ଗୋଟେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଜନସାଧାରଣଙ୍କ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ଦୃଢ଼ ହେଲେ ସେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତାକୁ କେହି ବାଧା ବା କ୍ଷତି ପହଞ୍ଚେଇ ପାରିବେ ନାହିଁ। He states that nationalism is an ideology of specific group of people wishing to create a nation where one does not exist, saying that it ought to exist. It is a political ideology. Nationalism is a political ideology of a specific group of people wishing to create a nation. ଗୋଟେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ନିର୍ମାଣ ପାଇଁ, ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସୃଷ୍ଟି ପାଇଁ at present the states are not connoted only as states. States are connoted as nation states. ଆଜିର ଦିନରେ, ଆଜିର ବିଶ୍ୱରେ ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରକୁ ଗୋଟେ ଜାତି ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଛି, ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ଜାତିକୁ ଗୋଟେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଛି ବା ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରକୁ ଜାତି ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଛି। କାରଣ ଜାତି ତାକୁ ହିଁ କୁହାଯାଏ ଯେଉଁଠି ସେ ଜାତିର ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ହୃଦୟ ମନରେ ଜାତୀୟତା ବୋଧ ଥାଏ। ତେଣୁ ଗୋଟିଏ ଜାତି ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ପରିଣତ ହୁଏ ଆଉ ଗୋଟିଏ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ଗୋଟେ ଜାତିରେ ପରିଚିତ, ଜାତି ଭାବେ ପରିଚିତ ହୁଅନ୍ତି। It is also an ideology of a people who have achieved nationhood. Nationalism is also an ideology of a people who have achieved nationhood. In Africa, there have been two kinds of nationalism during struggle for political independence since 1945. ଦୁଇ ପ୍ରକାରର ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହରେ ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହୋଇଥିଲା। ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରୀୟ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପାଇଁ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କରୁଥିଲେ, ସେହି ସମୟରେ ଦୁଇ ପ୍ରକାର ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହୋଇଥିଲା। First, there has been the ethnic sub-nationalism of a community speaking one language. ପ୍ରଥମେ ସେଇମାନେ ଗୋଟିଏ ଜାତି ଭାବରେ ବା ଜାତୀୟତା ରୂପକ ଆଦର୍ଶର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ବୋଲି ପରିଚିତ ହେଉଥିଲେ, ଯେଉଁମାନେ ଗୋଟିଏ ଭାଷାକୁ ନେଇ ପରିଚିତ ଥିଲେ। ଭାଷା ପରିଚୟରେ ପରିଚିତ ଥିବା ସମସ୍ତ ଜନସାଧାରଣ କୁ ଗୋଟେ ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପ ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଥିଲା। ସେମାନଙ୍କର ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପାଇଁ ଯେଉଁ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ ଆରମ୍ଭ ହେଇଥିଲା ତାହାକୁ ସବ୍ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ୍ ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଥିଲା। There has been multi-ethnic nationalism where men and women of different ethnic sub-nations have striven together. Another nationalism, ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର nationalism ହେଉଛି ଯାହାକୁ ଆମେ ପଢୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇଟା ହେଉଛି ବହୁତ ଗୁଡ଼ିଏ ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପ ସେମାନଙ୍କର ଏଥନିକ ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟିକୁ ଗୌଣ କରି ନ୍ୟାସନାଲ ଆଟିଚ୍ୟୁଡକୁ ପ୍ରାଧାନ୍ୟ ଦେଇ ଏକତ୍ର ଭାବରେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ପରିଚୟରେ ପରିଚିତ ହେବା ପାଇଁ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କରୁଥିଲେ। ସିଏ ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ। ପ୍ରଥମ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମକୁ ସବ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ କୁହାଯାଉଥିଲା ଏବଂ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମକୁ ନେସନହୁଡ ରୂପକ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଥିଲା। Nationalism was a strong feature of African civilization in the pre-colonial period. ଉପନିବେଶବାଦ ଶାସନ ଆରମ୍ଭ ପୂର୍ବରୁ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହରେ ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ ରୂପକ ଧାରଣା ଖୁବ ଦୃଢ ଥିଲା। Colonial rule in general had the twin effects of weakening nationalism and encouraging ethnic sub-nationalism. Colonial rule ର policy ଥିଲା divide and rule, ଗୋଟେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭିତରେ ଥିବା ବିଭିନ୍ନ ethnic groupଙ୍କର sub-nationalism, ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ethnic groupକୁ sub-nationalism ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଛି। ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର nationalismକୁ ବାସ୍ତବ nationalism ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଉଛି। ଉପନିବେଶିକ ବା ବିଦେଶୀ ଶାସକମାନେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମକୁ ଡିସ୍କରେଜ କରି ସବ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମକୁ ସେମାନେ ଏନକରେଜ କରୁଥିଲେ, ଯାହା ଫଳରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ ଯୋଉଟା କି ବିଦେଶୀ ଶାସନ ପୂର୍ବରୁ ଦୃଢ ଥିଲା ତାହା ଦୁର୍ବଳ ହେଇଗଲା। This may at first glance seem to be refuted by the simple observation that most of Africa's new political nations have grown during the colonial times. This was because the boundaries established in European countries to delineate colonial territories during the scramble. The remaining 30 African political nations are commonly supposed to be the mainly stateless societies and small states. Some political scientists would readily agree that each of the above ethnic group constitutes a nation. These political scientists can be said to belong to the objective school. The basic assumptions of the objective school are that the term nation applies to a people who have common ancestry and common history and possess group values, or as John Stuart Mill expressed it, common sympathies. But according to subjective school, a people of the same nation have a common nationality. They may be part of a nation state such as Scots with Great Britain or nation within the Nigerian state. The objective school emphasizes several criteria for a nation. The subjective school emphasizes one or two criteria. Their position can be reflected in Ernest Haas' definition of a nation. According to him, a nation is a socially mobilized body. Remember it, a nation is a socially mobilized body of individuals believing themselves to be united by some set of characteristics that differentiate them from outsiders and striving to create or maintain their own state. ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ନିର୍ମାଣ ପାଇଁ ଗୋଟିଏ ଭୌଗୋଳିକ ଅଞ୍ଚଳର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରୀୟ ଚେତନାରେ ଅନୁପ୍ରାଣିତ ହେଇ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଗଠନ କଲେ ତାହାକୁ ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ କୁହାଯାଏ। Ethnicity and nationalism In 19th century Europe, the national group called the nation was expected to become the basis of political nation state, Jati Rashtra. The nation state then came to be regarded as the model of the modern state. In case of Africa, the states of which are clearly multi-ethnic, no nation state has no meaning. ବିଂଶ ଶତାବ୍ଦୀର ମଧ୍ୟଭାଗରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପାଇଁ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କରିବା ବେଳକୁ ଦେଖା ଦେଇଥିଲା ଯେ ଗୋଟିଏ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପରେ ବିଭକ୍ତ ହେଇ ପରସ୍ପର ସହିତ ପ୍ରତିଦ୍ୱନ୍ଦିତା କରୁଛନ୍ତି ବୋଲି ଏବଂ ଯାହାକି କଲୋନିଆଲ ରୁଲର ଇଣ୍ଟରେଷ୍ଟକୁ ଖୁବ୍ ସୁହାଇଥିଲା. The modern state in African context is an alien concept. It was imported and transplanted by the colonial powers. Neither the European nation nor the African tribe was a primordial natural grouping. In the pre-industrial societies, individuals were tried not to large nations or tribes, but to much smaller localized groups. They belong to villages, clans, or small regions. In Africa, combination of socio-economic change, missionary language policies, anthropological studies, and deliberate attempts by the colonial authorities to establish a workable administrative framework caused Africans to move beyond narrower identification with a lineage or a clan or to see themselves as members of large and newly invented tribes. You know, African culture was primarily tribal in nature. Their nation building process was very weak, and the colonial powers, the allied rulers, have further worsened their nationalism, and during the independence period of African nations, the African freely independent nations inherited a weak political order which was not able to build a strong nationhood or strong nationalism in each state. The fact that most African countries did avoid violent ethnic conflict despite very unfavorable conditions. Ethnic diversity on the one hand and state weakness on the other. Mind it, ethnic diversity ଗୋଟିଏ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭିତରେ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଏଥନିକ୍ ଗ୍ରୁପର ପ୍ରତିଦ୍ୱନ୍ଦିତା ଏବଂ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଦୁର୍ବଳତା ଗୋଟିଏ ୱିକ୍ ପଲିଟିକାଲ ଅର୍ଡରକୁ ସୂଚିତ କରୁଥିଲା. The ethnic politics, African politics was primarily, basically ethnic politics. Ethnic politics of the immediate post-independence period can be characterized on the whole. The current democratization process in Africa has also provoked a defense of the authoritarian state among certain African leaders. President Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya has argued that the liberties of democracy will unleash ethnic rivalry and destroy the fragile unity of the country. The Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia argued that adoption of a multi-party system would bring chaos, anarchy, bloodshed, and death. All these nations and the leaders of the African nations, they argued that ethnic groups should be controlled by the state power and more the opportunity or more privilege or more rights and freedom granted to ethnic groups will endanger the nationalism of African nations. However, there are various ways in which the heterogeneity of a society can be constitutionally or institutionally expressed. Attitude towards ethnic nationalism and ethnicity in 1990s are quite different from those of the 1960s. The open ethnicization of politics resulting from multi-party elections has not always been so destructive. In some cases, openly ethnic nature of political parties may even help the process of democratization in the long run by making these parties more sensitive to the demands of particular constituencies. The African societies underwent different political and socio-economic experiences under colonial powers. The tribal values, norms, and structures survived the colonial experience, even then their existence was not legally recognized. ଉପନିବେଶିକ ବା ବିଦେଶୀ ଶାସନ ସମୟରେ ଯଦିଓ ଆଫ୍ରିକାର ଜାତୀୟତାବାଦ ଦୁର୍ବଳ ହୋଇ ପଡ଼ିଥିଲା ତଥାପି ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ଥିବା ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପ ମାନଙ୍କର ଆଇଡେଣ୍ଟିଟି ସେମାନଙ୍କର ଡିଷ୍ଟିଂକ୍ଟ ଫିଚର ତଥାପି ବଞ୍ଚି ରହିଥିଲା ଯାହାକି ପରବର୍ତ୍ତୀ ସମୟରେ ତାହା ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ନିର୍ମାଣ ପାଇଁ ଏକ ବାଧକ ହେଇଥିଲା. Under the process of modernization, the migration from rural to urban areas grew and the individuals were beset with multiple identities. In the post-independent period, African states inherited the colonial legacy and the crisis of dual identity for Africa continued. In this unit, there are 4 questions. Define the concepts of nation and multi-ethnic nationalism in African context. ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହରେ ନେସନ ବା ଜାତିର ଧାରଣା ଉଲ୍ଲେଖ କର. ମଲ୍ଟି ଏଥନିକ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ ବା ସବ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ ବୋଲି ଯାହା କୁହାଯାଉଛି ମଲ୍ଟି ଏଥନିକ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ ର ସଂଜ୍ଞା ନିରୂପଣ କର. ଏକଥା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ନମ୍ବର 1 ର ଆନ୍ସର ଚାହୁଁଛି. In the pre-industrial societies, Africans were part of a national group, natural group. Do you agree? In the pre-industrial societies, Africans were part of a natural group. ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ବିଦେଶୀ ଶାସନ ଆରମ୍ଭ ପୂର୍ବରୁ ବା କଲୋନିଆଲାଇଜେସନ ପୂର୍ବରୁ ଗୋଟିଏ ଗୋଟିଏ ନ୍ୟାଚୁରାଲ ଗ୍ରୁପ ରେ ପରିଚିତ ଥିଲେ ତାହାକୁ ତା ସପକ୍ଷରେ ବା ବିପକ୍ଷରେ ଯୁକ୍ତି ଦର୍ଶାଅ. Question number 2. Why did most of the African countries reject ethnic nationalism during post-independent period? Ethnic nationalism କିଭଳି ଭାବରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ପାଇଁ କ୍ଷତିକାରକ ଥିଲା, ତାହାକୁ ଆଗକୁ ବଢିବାକୁ ଦିଆଯାଇ ନଥିଲା ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ। କେଉଁ ସମୟରେ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପରବର୍ତ୍ତୀ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ଆରମ୍ଭ ହେଲା 1957ରୁ 1993 ମସିହା ଭିତରେ। ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଗୁଡିକ ଔପନିବେଶିକ ଶାସନ କବଳରୁ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ଲାଭ କରିଥିଲେ। ଏହି ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ଲାଭ କରିବା ପରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ଥିବା ଏଥନିକ ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜିମ କୁ କିଭଳି କଣ୍ଟ୍ରୋଲ କରାଯାଇଥିଲା ସେ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ବିବରଣୀ ଲେଖ। What are the factors responsible for the resurgence of ethnic conflict in the countries like Burundi, Rwanda in the 1990s? এই ସବୁ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ବୁରୁଣ୍ଡି, ରୁଆଣ୍ଡାରେ ଏଥନିକ କନଫ୍ଲିକ୍ଟ, ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପ ଭିତରେ କିଭଳି କନଫ୍ଲିକ୍ଟ ର ପୁନଃନବୀକରଣ, ପୁଣି ଥରେ କନଫ୍ଲିକ୍ଟ ଦେଖା ଦେଇଥିଲା, ତୀବ୍ର ଆକାର ଧାରଣ କରିଥିଲା ଏବଂ ଏଥିପାଇଁ କେଉଁ କାରଣ ଦାୟୀ ସେଗୁଡ଼ିକୁ ଉଲ୍ଲେଖ କର। 4ଟା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଅଛି ୟୁନିଟ 13 ରେ। ହ୍ୟାଲୋ 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 ହ୍ୟାଲୋ।
ହଁ ସାର୍।
4ଟା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଅଛି ୟୁନିଟ 13 ରେ। ଆଟେମ୍ପ ନେଇପାରିବ?
ହଁ ସାର୍, ହେଇଯିବ।
Unit 14 is about violence and its manifestation. Defining violence, causes of violence, direct violence, violence by omission, mediated violence, repressive violence, and alienating violence. इति प्रकार violence अफ्रीका महादेश रे पढ़िबा। The concept of violence encompasses physical violence, psychological violence, structural violence. Violence ଯାହାକୁ ଆମେ ଓଡ଼ିଆରେ କହୁ ହିଂସା ବୋଲି, ଶାରୀରିକ ହିଂସା, ମନସ୍ତାତ୍ତ୍ୱିକ ହିଂସା ଏବଂ structural ବା ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀଗତ ହିଂସା। Thus, violence can be any act that threatens a person's physical and psychological integrity, and it also can be racism, forced labor, and denial of individual fundamental rights. Violence can be caused either by individual or a group of people, the state itself, or society as a whole. Violence ର ଫଳାଫଳ ହେଉଛି ଏହା, ଜଣେ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିର ଶାରୀରିକ ଏବଂ ମନସ୍ତାତ୍ତ୍ୱିକ ସ୍ଥିତି ପ୍ରତି ବିପଦ ସୃଷ୍ଟି କରେ ଏବଂ ଶ୍ରମିକକୁ ବାଧ୍ୟ କରେ ଶ୍ରମଦାନ କରିବା ପାଇଁ, ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିକୁ ତାର ମୌଳିକ ଅଧିକାର ଉପଭୋଗ ପାଇଁ ସୁଯୋଗ ଦିଏ ନାହିଁ। Violence can be caused either by individual, ଜଣେ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ଦ୍ୱାରା ହିଂସାତ୍ମକ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ ହୋଇପାରେ, ବା ଗୋଟେ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ଦ୍ୱାରା ହେଇପାରେ, ବା ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଦ୍ୱାରା ବି ହିଂସା ସୃଷ୍ଟି କରାଯାଇପାରେ, ବା ସୋସାଇଟି ଦ୍ୱାରା ବା ସମାଜ ଦ୍ୱାରା ହେଇପାରେ। ଆଫ୍ରିକା କଥା ଯଦି ଆମେ ପଢିବା, the violence in Africa is responsible for many and untold misery. It was estimated that during the decade of 1980s, 80 ଦଶକରେ 1980 ରୁ 1990 ମସିହା ମଧ୍ୟରେ Alone, over 3 million people lost their lives in Africa due to violence, and around 160 million constantly suffered consequences of civil war, ଗୃହଯୁଦ୍ଧ। ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଏଥନିକ ଗ୍ରୁପ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ହୋଇଥିବା କନଫ୍ଲିକ୍ଟ ବା ଗୃହଯୁଦ୍ଧ ଗୋଟିଏ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭିତରେ ଏକାଧିକ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ଦୁଇ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ବା ଦୁଇରୁ ଅଧିକ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ ହେଲେ, ଲଢେଇ ହେଲେ, ବିଦ୍ୱେଷ ଦେଖାହେଲେ ତାକୁ ସିଭିଲ ୱାର ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଏ। ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭିତରେ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀଗତ ଲଢେଇକୁ ସିଭିଲ ୱାର ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଏ। Since 1960, Africa has been 19 full-fledged civil wars, along with 11 genocide, ଗଣହତ୍ୟା, and politicides compared within the 24 that occurred all over the world. ସମଗ୍ର ବିଶ୍ୱରେ 24ଟା ଗଣହତ୍ୟା ହୋଇଥିଲା ବେଳେ କେବଳ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ 11ଟି ଥିଲା ତା ଭିତରୁ। Defining violence. Violence can be divided into two broad categories: direct violence and structural violence. Direct violence is an act of deliberate attack on physical or psychological integrity of a human being. It is also called as somatic violence. As described, it is a commonly understood form of violence as it is easily observable and often illustrated in the media all over the world. It also includes any form of a brutal action like torture, rape, kidnapping, and forced removal, where the victim is inflicted with physical and psychological suffering. The form of violence is rampant in Africa. Africa ମହାଦେଶରେ ହିଂସା ଅତି ଉତ୍କଟ ଏବଂ ଉଗ୍ର ରୂପ ରହିଛି। The second form of violence is structural violence. It is also called as indirect violence. It is a situation in which there is no necessary direct relationship between the victim and the aggressor. This violence showed that the state could resort to systematic violence against its citizens. Defining violence purely in somatic terms was incomplete. Violence was a cause of difference between potential and the actual. The potential level of realization is that which is possible within a given level of insight and resources. If insight and resources are monopolized by a group or a class, the actual level falls below the potential level. Violence could take place even when there is no direct actor involved. There may not be any person who directly harms another person. The people or institutions responsible for such violence are not often considered guilty of a criminal offense by the law or by society. This kind of violence is in fact but it into the structure and shows up because of unequal power and consequently unequal life chances. Structural violence କୁ ହିଁ କୁହାଯାଏ ଯେଉଁଠି ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ମଧ୍ୟରେ there is the balance, there is the lack of balance of power বা unequal power sharing ଥାଏ। ସେଠାରେ ଗୋଟେ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ବା ଏକାଧିକ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ସମୂହକୁ ପ୍ରତି ଭାଉଲେନ୍ସ ଆଚରଣ କରାଯାଏ, not directly but indirectly. The general cause for structural violence is inequality. Structural violence includes the following three types. First, violence by omission. Second, repressive violence. And it is finally the alienating violence. Direct violence, genocide, massacre, murder, brutal acts, torture, rape, maltreatment, forced removal of population, kidnapping, taking of hostages, imprisonment, forced labor, ये ସବୁ ଗୁଡ଼ିକ ହେଉଛି direct violence. Direct violence ର category ହେଉଛି homicide, brutal acts, restrictions or physical constraints. Homicide category ମଧ୍ୟରେ genocide ଆସୁଛି, massacre ଆସୁଛି, murder ଆସୁଛି. Brutal act ମଧ୍ୟରେ torture, rape, maltreatment. Restrictions or physical constraint ଭିତରେ forced removal of population, kidnapping, taking of hostages, imprisonment, forced labor ଆସୁଛି. Indirect violence. Indirect violence is the lack of protection against social violence, hunger, disease, poverty. କ୍ଷୁଧା ଯୋଗୁଁ ବହୁତ ଲୋକ ମୃତ୍ୟୁ ମୁଖରେ ପଡ଼ିବା ବା ମହାମାରୀ ଯୋଗୁଁ ବହୁତ ଲୋକ ମୃତ୍ୟୁ ମୁଖରେ ପଡ଼ିବା ବା ପଭର୍ଟି ଯୋଗୁଁ ମାଲନ୍ୟୁଟ୍ରିସନ ର ଶିକାର ହବା ଯାହାକୁ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ବା ସମାଜ ସୁରକ୍ଷା ନ ଦେବାକୁ କୁହାଯାଏ ଇନଡାଇରେକ୍ଟ ଭାଉଲେନ୍ସ. Lack of protection against accidents, lack of protection against natural violence, hurricanes, earthquakes, these are. Social rights, denial of trade union, denial of social equality, denial of participation in social and economic life, denial of protection of material, individual and collective property, civil right, denial of protection of civil right by the state, political rights, denial, alienating violence, deprivation of higher rights, alienating living conditions at work, at home, at school, social ostracism, ସାମାଜିକ ବାସନ୍ଦ, hostility against certain members and groups of society like women and children, ethnocide. Causes of violence. କଣ ପାଇଁ violence ଆଫ୍ରିକାରେ ଏତେ ତୀବ୍ର? In Africa, violence is an age-old phenomenon. Violence is directly associated with the scarcity of certain elementary goods which are needed by human beings and protection of such as food and shelter. Along with the problem of scarcity, ମୁଖ୍ୟତଃ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ଲାର୍ଜ ସ୍କେଲ ଭାଉଲେନ୍ସର ପ୍ରମୁଖ କାରଣ ହେଉଛି ଅଭାବ ଜନିତ ପରିସ୍ଥିତି. କଣ ଅଭାବ? ଖାଦ୍ୟ ଅଭାବ. ଆମେ ମୂଳରୁ ପଢିଛନ୍ତି African people are striven by poverty, hunger and illiteracy. Along with the problem of scarcity of essential goods, important point, the organization of human society. The societies are organized in such a way that a group of individuals fulfill their needs, not the entire society. ସମାଜର ଗୋଟିଏ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ସମସ୍ତ ବା କିଛି ଅଧିକ ସୁଯୋଗ ପାଉଥିଲା ବେଳେ ଅନ୍ୟ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ସେଥିରୁ ଡିପ୍ରାଇଭ ହେଇକି ରହୁଛନ୍ତି, ବଞ୍ଚିତ ହେଇକି ରହୁଛନ୍ତି. The societies are organized in such a way that a group of individuals fulfill their needs, not the entire society. This has resulted in competition and a rivalry that ultimately results in violence. In Africa, more than 70% of the resources and the bottom 30% of population amasses more than 70% of the resources, and the bottom 30% is left with merely 10% of resources. Equal, not equal distribution of resources, unequal distribution of resources. In Africa, ethnicity is the second source of violence. First source of violence is scarcity and unequal distribution of resources among groups. Second source of violence is ethnicity, what we have studied earlier. Direct violence. Other sources of violence are civil war, political rivalry, as we have studied earlier. मुख्यतः चारोटी कारण ପାଇଁ आफ्रिकार लार्ज स्केल भायोलेंस होउची. प्रथम होउची अभाव जनित भायोलेंस, द्वितीय unequal distribution of resources ପାଇଁ violence, तृतीय कारण होउची सिविल वार ପାଇଁ violence होउची, एवं चतुर्थ कारण राजनैतिक शत्रुता ପାଇଁ ମଧ୍ୟ एते लार्ज स्केल भायोलेंस आफ्रिका महादेश रे होउची. The most brutal form of violence in Africa is all the time reeling under it. It involves direct physical attack with an intention to inflict injury or even to kill either an individual or a group practices it. In Africa, this form of violence is mostly observed in clashes between two ethnic groups or rival political groups. Rwanda and Burundi are an ideal case of direct violence between two groups. এই দুই রাষ্ট্ରରେ ଗୃହ ଯୁଦ୍ଧ ସିଭିଲ ୱାର ଭାଓଲେନ୍ସର ପ୍ରମୁଖ କାରଣ ଅଟେ. The civil wars fought in Africa are the major source of violence. In Angola, a long civil war which lasted for over 20 years, the longest civil war in the world, has destroyed the fabric of the society. Africa महादेशर अंगोला रे जो सिविल वार हेतिला ता 20 वर्ष धरी लागि रहितिला. पृथ्वी इतिहास रे यह सबुठारु अंगोला सिविल वार को दीर्घतम सिविल वार बोली विवेचना करा जाए. It started with a fight to capture power in 1975 and ended in 1995. Violence by omission. Violence by omission refers to the nation of non-assistance to human beings in danger. मानव समाज जेतेबे संकट रे पड़ी थाए, विपद रे पड़ी थाए, राष्ट्र जदि ताकू सहायता न करे ताहले ताकू कहा जाए violence by omission. Omission by states, nations. The states have resources and manpower to assist citizens who are caught in natural or man-made disasters. In the case of violence against a minority group by the majority group, the police force should intervene to protect the minority group. Example ହେଉଛି ଯେଉଁଠି ସଂଖ୍ୟାଗରିଷ୍ଠ ଜନସାଧାରଣଙ୍କ ଦ୍ୱାରା ସଂଖ୍ୟାଲଘୁ ଅପରେସନ ବା ଭାଓଲେନ୍ସର ଶିକାର ହୁଅନ୍ତି ସେ ସମୟରେ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ପାଖରେ ପୋଲିସ ଫୋର୍ସ ଅଛି ହସ୍ତକ୍ଷେପ କରି ସଂଖ୍ୟାଲଘୁକୁ ସୁରକ୍ଷା ଦେବା ଆବଶ୍ୟକ ଯଦି ସଂଖ୍ୟାଲଘୁକୁ ସୁରକ୍ଷା ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଦେଇନାହିଁ ତାହେଲେ ତାକୁ ଭାଓଲେନ୍ସ ବାଇ ଓମିସନ କୁହାଯିବ ବୋଲିକି ଏକ୍ସାମ୍ପଲ କହୁଛି similarly in the case of predictable natural disasters the state should take emergency measures to protect the life of citizens. If the state fails to intervene when human lives are threatened by phenomena like harmful effects of which are technically avoidable or controllable to protect, then it becomes violence of omission. Natural disaster, flood, cyclone, diseases by epidemics like cholera, diarrhea, AIDS, ଏ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଷ୍ଟେଟ୍ ଜନସାଧାରଣଙ୍କୁ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଦୃଷ୍ଟିକୋଣରୁ ପଦକ୍ଷେପ ନେଇକି ପ୍ରୋଟେକ୍ସନ ଦେବା କଥା ଏବଂ ଦେଇ ବି ପାରିବ ଯଦି ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସେ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ ଦାୟିତ୍ୱ ତୁଲାଉ ନାହିଁ ତାହେଲେ ତାକୁ ଭାଓଲେନ୍ସ ବାଇ ଓମିସନ ବୋଲି କୁହାଯିବ. Hunger is a common example of violence of omission in Africa. African people are striven by hunger, ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରର ଦାୟିତ୍ୱ ସମସ୍ତ ଜନସାଧାରଣଙ୍କୁ ଦିନକୁ 2 ବେଳା ଗୁଣାତ୍ମକ ଖାଦ୍ୟ ଯୋଗାଇବା ଏବଂ ଏଇଟା ହେଉଛି ସବୁଠାରୁ ବ୍ରାଇଟ୍ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଗ୍ଲାରିଂ ଏକ୍ସାମ୍ପଲ ଅଫ୍ violence by omission in Africa. Hunger is a common example of violence of omission in Africa. It is called as the silent violence of modern times. There are undernourishments and deaths after natural disasters. But on many occasions in Africa, it is not because food is not available, but because of several social and political reasons. Health is the second common example of violence of omission in Africa. Within a country, it is common to observe that people's vulnerability to diseases varies considerably according to regional, social, and ethnic factors. Urban versus rural areas and political power to allocate public money for a particular region play a key role. Mediated violence. It refers to deliberate human intervention to change the existing natural and social environment, which might not immediately affect the victims, but in the long run, it would have profound negative effects. In mediated violence, the aggressor and victims are not in a direct relationship. ସିଧାସଳଖ ଭାବରେ ଆଗ୍ରେସର ଭିକ୍ଟିମ ପ୍ରତି ଭାଓଲେନ୍ସ ଆଚରଣ କରେ ନାହିଁ. Through different and indirect ways, the violence occurs. That is called mediated violence. The most common observable phenomena are efforts to change natural environment like nuclear test, industrial pollution, or the sale of products that pose a danger to their users. In Africa, the common practice among the US and European multinationals is the sale of a wide range of toxic products that are banned in their home countries because they can induce cancer, generic malformations, or miscarriages. विशेष करी यूरोपियन नेशंस मल्टीनेशनल्स यूएस आफ्रिका महादेश रे जो निशा द्रव्य व्यवहार प्रसार घटुचंती ता द्वारा आफ्रिका महादेश जनसाधारण कैंसर जेनेरिक माल फॉर्मेशंस भली रोग रे आक्रांत होउचंती जहाको कहा जाए मेडिएटेड वायलेंस सीधा सड़क वायलेंस हैला नहीं माध्यम जरिया रे वायलेंस क्रिएट करा जाई जनसाधारण को क्षतिग्रस्त करा गला mediated violence was also the part of the colonial agricultural policies in many African countries. The colonial authorities forcibly introduced crops which worked as input to industries. ବୈଦେଶିକ ବା ଉପନିବେଶିକ ଶାସନ ସମୟରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ଶାସନ କରୁଥିବା ଇଂଲଣ୍ଡ, ଫ୍ରାନ୍ସ, ପର୍ତ୍ତୁଗାଲ ଆଦି ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରମାନଙ୍କ ଦ୍ୱାରା ଏଭଳି କୃଷି କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ ପ୍ରଚଳନ କରାଗଲା ଯାହା ପ୍ରତି ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ଅପରିଚିତ ଥିଲେ ଏବଂ ସେହି କୃଷି କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ ଶିଳ୍ପ ସମୃଦ୍ଧ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ୟୁରୋପିଆନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଗୁଡିକର ଇଣ୍ଡଷ୍ଟ୍ରିର କଞ୍ଚାମାଲ ଯୋଗାଣ ପାଇଁ ଉଦ୍ଦିଷ୍ଟ ଥିଲା ଯାହା ଫଳରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ଟ୍ରାଡିସନାଲ କ୍ରପ ଲୋପ ପାଇଲା ଏବଂ ୱେଷ୍ଟର୍ଣ୍ଣ କ୍ରପ इंट्रोड्यूस हैला जाकी सफल हेई पारि नथिला एवं फूड अवेलेबिलिटी को कमे देला it has often resulted in marked decrease in food availability among the rural communities repressive violence and alienating violence repressive violence refers to conditions when survival is not threatened but other fundamental rights are not given. It constitutes an important infringement of the freedom, dignity, and equality of rights to which human beings are entitled. Repressive violence अर्थ होची जड़े व्यक्तिर स्थिति प्रति यह विपद में बरं व्यक्तिर स्वाधीनता व्यक्ति मर्यादा समानता भली आवश्यकता को व्यक्ति प्रति उपलब्ध करा न जिबा बा व्यक्ति को मना बारण करा जिबा व्यवस्था को रिप्रेसिव वायलेंस बोली कहा जाए alienating violence is a kind of violence that refers to the deprivation of a person's higher rights such as the right to emotional right to culture or intellectual growth. The secondary rights, denial of secondary rights is called alienating violence. Denial of primary rights is called repressive violence. After the Second World War, laws became more repressive and discriminating. The Population Registration Act of 1950 classified every citizen according to the ethnic group. This became the basis for the white government to treat each ethnic group. The government tried to control interracial marriage to maintain purity of white blood. These are the legacies of colonial rule in Africa. Political activities were totally denied for the blacks. Africa Mahadeshwara Janasadharana, you know, are black in complexion, and the European nations, the people of European nations are white in complexion. There was a wide gap among Africans and Europeans. The European rulers like Britain, France, Portuguese, Belgium were privileged and the Africans are unprivileged from a different point of view in administration. The African National Congress was in the forefront of struggle against this kind of discriminating rule. The government enacted the Unlawful Organization Act 1960 to ban the activities of the ANC and other parties. It empowered the president to declare ANC and others as illegal without prior notice to the organization, if in his view they threaten or likely to threaten public safety or exercise of Unit 14. There are 4 questions. Question number 1, ethnicity is the main cause of violence. Do you agree on the basis of your study of violence in Africa? ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ହିଂସାର ମୁଖ୍ୟ କାରଣ ହେଉଛି ଏଥନିସିଟି। ଏହାକୁ ସମର୍ଥନ କରୁଛ କି ନାହିଁ ସେ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ଯୁକ୍ତି ଦର୍ଶାଇବା ପାଇଁ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ନମ୍ବର 1 କହୁଛି। Question number 2, define direct violence and explain how civil war is responsible for the incidents of direct violence. Cite instances from Africa. Civil war, Angolar civil war, ଯାହାକୁ world longest civil war ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଏ, ସେଇଟା citation ହୋଇପାରିବ ଏବଂ other civil wars ମଧ୍ୟ citation ହୋଇପାରିବ question number 2 ରେ। Question number 3, identify an example of mediated violence in Africa. Mediated violence refers to the violence by different methods, not directly but indirectly. Like we can take an example of toxic material trade in Africa by US and European nations. ନିଶାଦ୍ରବ୍ୟ ବ୍ୟବସାୟ ଯାହାଦ୍ୱାରା ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ପରୋକ୍ଷ ଭାବରେ ଏଥିରେ କବଳିତ ହେଇ ବହୁ ମୃତ୍ୟୁ ହୋଇଥିଲା ଏବଂ ବହୁ ଲୋକ ମାଲ ନରିଷ୍ଟ ହେଇଥିଲେ, ତାକୁ ଆମେ ଏକ୍ସାମ୍ପଲ ଭାବେ ଦର୍ଶାଇ ପାରିବା। Question number 4, the white rule in South Africa was responsible for repressive violence and alienating violence. Repressive violence ର definition ଲେଖିବା, ତାର features ଗୁଡ଼ିକ ଲେଖିବା, ଠିକ ସେଇଭଳି alienating violence ର definition ତାର features ଗୁଡ଼ିକ ଲେଖିବା। ସାଉଥ ଆଫ୍ରିକାରେ ବ୍ରିଟିଶ ଶାସନ ଯୋଉଟାକୁ ହ୍ୱାଇଟ୍ ରୁଲ୍, ଉପନିବେଶ ବିଦେଶ ଶାସନ ହ୍ୱାଇଟ୍ ରୁଲ୍, ବ୍ରିଟେନର ଶାସନ କିଭଳି ରିପ୍ରେସିଭ ଭାଉଲେନ୍ସ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଆଲିଏନେଟିଭ ଭାଉଲେନ୍ସ ର କାରଣ ବନିଥିଲା ତାକୁ ଆମେ ଦେଖିବା। That is about unit 14 and next is unit 15, economic cooperation continental and regional. ଅର୍ଥନୈତିକ ସହଯୋଗ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ଅନ୍ୟାନ୍ୟ ମହାଦେଶ ସହିତ ଅର୍ଥନୈତିକ ସହଯୋଗ ଏବଂ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଗୁଡ଼ିକ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ଅର୍ଥନୈତିକ ସହଯୋଗ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ପାଠ। ୟୁନିଟ୍ 15, continental initiatives in the sub-Saharan Africa, African Union, Nepal, regional initiative in the sub-Saharan Africa, what is regional economic integration, economic community of West African states, economic organizations, Southern Africa Development Coordination Conference, the Common Market for Eastern and South Africa. These are the organizations for economic cooperation. You know, after attaining independence during 1950s to 1960, the African countries embarked economic cooperation and regional integration as part of the strategy for structural transformation of Africa. ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପାଇବା ପରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ଗରିବ ଏବଂ ଅଣବିକଶିତ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭାବରେ ଜନ୍ମ ଲାଭ କରିଥିଲେ, ଆତ୍ମପ୍ରକାଶ କରିଥିଲେ। ସେହି ସମୟରେ ବିକାଶ ପାଇଁ ପୁଞ୍ଜି ବା ଅର୍ଥର ଆବଶ୍ୟକ ଥିଲା। ପୁଞ୍ଜି ବା ଅର୍ଥ ଅନ୍ୟାନ୍ୟ ସୂତ୍ରରୁ ଆଣିବା ଅପେକ୍ଷା ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ସମୂହ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ଏକ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଅର୍ଥନୈତିକ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ଗଠନ କରି ପାରସ୍ପରିକ ସହଯୋଗ ପାଇଁ ପଦକ୍ଷେପ ନେଇଥିଲେ। The desire to overcome the economic disadvantages of fragmentation gave rise to the establishment of regional institutions whose overriding objective was the creation of self-reliant development of member states. These include Customs and Economic Union of Central Africa, UDECA, 1964 creation ହେଇଥିଲା, which later became the Central African Community 1967 to 1977. The South Africa Customs South Africa Customs Union SACU was created in the year 1969. The Southern African Development Coordinating Conference SADCC was created in 1980, which was later transformed into Southern African Development Community in 1992. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa was created in 1995. The West African Economic Community was created in 1972. The Economic Community of Western African States was created in 1975. And the West African Economic and Monetary Union was created in 1994. The Preferential Trade Area was created in 1981, which was later succeeded by COMESA in 1995. These are the regional economic forums within Africa continent. In addition to political objective of continental unity, Mahadasya Ekata, the African leaders also pursued regional integration in order to overcome three fundamental development constraints characteristics of the African economic, namely small size of the economies, the lack of structural complementaries as manifested in the narrow set of similar, low value primary export products and basic minerals, and dependence on the import of immediate and final goods. Regional integration was viewed as offering opportunities leading to market expansion, economies of scale, and diversification of the economic base. Continental initiative in the sub-Saharan Africa. In 1970s, about a decade after the formation of OAU, Organization of African Union, African leaders took concrete steps aimed at addressing the plight of the continent. The first significant attempt was the 1973 Declaration on Cooperation, Development and Economic Independence. The features of regional economic groups are Africa's huge resource must be used primarily to meet the needs of the purposes of its people. मुख्य लक्ष्य थिला आफ्रिका महादेशर जो अर्थनैतिक गोष्ठी राष्ट्र गुड़ी को विभिन्न राष्ट्र को नहीं विभिन्न अर्थनैतिक गोष्ठी सब सृष्टि होइथिला बा आत्मप्रकाश करथिला तार मुख्य लक्ष्य आफ्रिका महादेशरे जो व्यापक संबल रही खनिज संपद खनिज संबल जंगल जात संपद लेबर फोर्स लेबर श्रमिक संबल ये सब गुड़िक आफ्रिका महादेशरे विनियोग हबो एवं आफ्रिका महादेशर जनसाधारण पई उपयोग हबो प्रथम लक्ष्य थिला द्वितीय लक्ष्य आफ्रिका टोटल रिलायंस ऑन द एक्सपोर्ट ऑफ रॉ मटेरियल मस्ट चेंज आफ्रिका महादेशर जो कंचामाल गुड़िक थिला ताकू ता ऊपर निर्भरशीलता ह्रास करिवा एवं कंचामाल गुड़ी को आफ्रिका महादेश ही प्रोसेसिंग करा जाई शिल्प कल कारखाना गुड़ी करे शिल्पजात द्रव्य भाव में एक्सपोर्ट करा जिया पई लक्ष्य रखा जाइतिला इन टर्म्स ऑफ सेल्फ रिलायंस Africa must mobilize all its human and material resources for her development. These efforts should enhance the move towards African economic integration. National governments should develop economic, social, and cultural policies that are formed by the LPA objectives. The LPA identifies 7 priority areas notably in food and agriculture, in human resource development, transport and communication development, eliminating illiteracy. These are called LPA. The aim was that the proposed LPA interventions would lead to the formation of sub-regional bodies throughout the continent and the establishment of African common market. Ultimately, an African economic community. In this sense, the LPA was seen as the continent's struggle against underdevelopment. In order to eradicate the poverty of the people, in order to provide education facility to the people of Africa, and to supply adequate food facility to its people, a number of regional economic groups were created within Africa. Its ultimate aim was to make Africa self-reliant in the field of economy, agriculture, industrial sector, business, trade, and commerce sector. All these goals was set to be achieved by formation of regional economic groups within Africa. African Union, the July 2001 OAU summit of Lusaka saw the birth of African Union. African Union 2001 ମସିହାରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ୟୁନିୟନ ନାମକ ଏକ ସଂଗଠନ ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହୋଇଥିଲା. At the same summit, another body, the new Partnership of Africa's Development, supposed to help the African Union realize economic integration and other pertinent issues. The establishment of the African Union is another major landmark event in the history of Africa. 2001 ମସିହାରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ୟୁନିୟନ ନାମକ ଯେଉଁ ସଂଗଠନ ଆନ୍ତର୍ଜାତୀୟ ସଂଗଠନ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶରେ ହିଁ ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହୋଇଥିଲା. ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ଇତିହାସରେ ଏହା ଏକ ଗୁରୁତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ ଅଧ୍ୟାୟ ଥିଲା। Africans are confident of the African Union and look to it as a body that will unite the whole continent and fulfill its expectations. They look forward to a smooth and event-free transition from OAU, Organization of African Union, to African Union. They expect the African Union to muster greater efforts by not only consolidating all that the African Union achieved before it, but also more especially by emphasizing on the economic development. The priority areas of African Union was that fostering greater unity and solidarity in Africa. Second, promoting and maintaining peace and stability in the continent. Third, promoting gender equality, human rights, and rule of law. Fourth, fostering good governance by applying democratic principles. Five, executing suitable programs and policies of reform to bring about accelerated social and economic development in order to improve living standards and the lot of the people. Six, taking deliberate but very definite steps to achieve economic integration. Seven, promoting social and economic cooperation across African states. Eight, attracting into Africa more investments in order to enhance the growth and expansion of industries and the creation of jobs. Nepal, in taking the continental interest forward in line with the establishment of a new multinational organization in their last OAU summit in Lusaka 2001, the African leaders accepted an economic blueprint for Africa's recovery, namely the new partnership of Africa's development. NEPAD, new partnership, new partnership of Africa's development, NEPAD, to be better able to respond to the challenges of changing national environment. The objective were same. The role of Africa, good governance, stability for development, investment. The response of Africa's international partners, market access, debt relief, business engage, seizing the opportunities presented, the way forward collaborative strategies for success, bridging the digital divide and global health initiative. Regional initiative, EAC, ECOWAS, SADCC, COMESS, SA. What is regional economic integration? International economic integration is a relatively new economic term and no evidence of its use prior to 1942 has been found by 1950. It is a new economic term, regional economic integration. It has no clear-cut meaning, but as a whole, ranging in meaning between two opposite extremes at the one end of the spectrum, the mere existence of trade relations between two independent economies is considered as a form of economic integration. The mere existence of trade relations between two independent economies is considered as a form of economic integration. While at the other end, nothing short of the total unification of two or more independent national economies is regarded as economic integration. The investigation of a number of alternative definitions is therefore essential if we are to come to an understanding of this concept. The concept of sub-regional regional economic cooperation is not new to African countries. There are a number of factors that account to the limited progress of such regional organizations during the period of 1960s and early 70s. Among others, six basic threats to regional integration schemes in developing countries are unequal distribution of benefits between members, one, two, ideological differences between members, three, weak institutional structures, four, intrusive power involvement, five, politicization of in, integration issues, and six, nationalism. Some of the important regional organizations in sub-Saharan Africa during period 1970 to 1990. Economic Community of West African States. Economic Community of West African States. It was created in the year 1975. The aim was to promote cooperation and development in the field of economic activity, particularly in the field of industry, transport, communication, energy, agriculture, natural resources, commerce, monetary and financial questions, and in social and cultural matters also. Next institution was Southern Africa Development Coordination Conference, SADCC, Southern Africa Development Coordination Conference. It was created in 1980 by Lusaka Declaration. The countries which were the member states included Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Swaziland, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Same was its objective. The objectives are economic growth, poverty alleviation, enhance the standard and quality of life of the Southern Africa people, support the socially disadvantaged through regional integration. These are the activities. The common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, it was created in mid 1960s with 20 members states, 20 states as members. The objective was to foster sustainable growth and development among its member nations by considering the strength and resources of each member. Next was performance. Number of economic groups, organizations within Africa, South Africa, within Africa continent were created, but their performance was not up to satisfactory because the fragmentation, the politicization, the politicization made all these economic organizations failure to achieve its objectives. There are 6 questions in this unit, in unit number 15. 6 questions. First is, what are the aims and objectives of the Lagos Plan of Action? What Question number 2, what led to the establishment of African Union? Question number 3, when was Nepal established and what are its priority areas? Question number 4, about ECOWS, when was it formed? What are its objectives? Question number 5, when was SADCC replaced by SADC? What are the main objectives? Question number 6, assess briefly the impact of sub-Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa's efforts to regional organization. These are the direct questions. There is nothing difficult in it. Last one is Unit 16, India-Africa relation. Unit 16 is about India-Africa relations. Historical background, colonial period, Indians in Africa, post-independence period, government's policy, African response, non-alignment, relations during the last 3 decades, South-South cooperation, political cooperation, India-Africa relation in the 21st century, globalization and interdependence, regional cooperation, India, diaspora in Africa. Indian subcontinent is the immediate neighbor to African continent separated by Indian Ocean. ଭାରତ ମହାସାଗର ଠିକ ଅପର ପାର୍ଶ୍ୱରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ଥିଲାବେଳେ ଭାରତ ମହାସାଗର ଉପକୂଳରେ ଭାରତୀୟ ଉପମହାଦେଶ ଅବସ୍ଥିତ. Indian Ocean water provided a route through which India established trading and commercial relations with African coast and Persian Gulf since prehistoric time. ପ୍ରାକ୍ ଐତିହାସିକ ସମୟରୁ ଭାରତ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ସହ ଭାରତ ମହାସାଗର ମଧ୍ୟ ଦେଇ ବାଣିଜ୍ୟ ବ୍ୟବସାୟ କରୁଥିବାର ପ୍ରମାଣ ମିଳେ. People to people level contacts between the Indians, East Africans and Arabs have predated the modern state relations for a very long time. Historical background. Though it is not possible to fix an exact date of the first Indian contact with Africa, the Western and Indian scholars believe that ancient Hindus had fairly good ideas of the East African coastline. India's contact with the East Africa are traced back to the age of Puranas. Colonial period বা উপনিবেশিক শাসন বা বৈদেশিক শাসন ସମୟରେ second phase of India Africa relation began with the discovery of sea route to east by the Portuguese in 1498 1498 ଖ୍ରୀଷ୍ଟାବ୍ଦରେ ଭାସ୍କୋଡା ଗାମା ପର୍ତ୍ତୁଗୀଜର ନାବିକ ଭାସ୍କୋଡା ଗାମା ଭାରତକୁ ଜଳପଥ ଆବିଷ୍କାର କରିବା ପରେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରଗୁଡ଼ିକ ସହିତ ଭାରତର ସମ୍ପର୍କ ଏକ ନୂଆ ଦିଗରେ ପହଞ୍ଚିଥିଲା. Indians in Africa, the Portuguese employed Indians in their African colonial position as bankers, accountants, and skilled artisans during 17th and 18th century. in the 19th century, Indian immigration to the East and Southeast African countries, Southwest Indian Ocean island states increased. The British employed them as skilled laborers to work on agricultural and sugar plantations, to build roads, railways, and administrative centers. Indian troops were employed to pacify and train militant African tribes in maintaining law and order. Ramachandi, in his book Uganda Asians, mentions the push and pull factors for Indian migration to East and South Africa in the 19th century. Independence period, government's policy. The government of India under Jawaharlal Nehru adopted anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-racialism as the basic tenets of India's foreign policy. You know, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was the architect of India's foreign policy. As India was a victim of colonial rule, India's foreign policy was against imperialism, colonialism, and also racialism. These were the agreements with the values of Indian freedom struggle under Mahatma Gandhi. As a consequence of this policy, India raised the problem of racial discrimination in UN in 1948 and broke diplomatic relations with South Africa. India favored a peaceful, non-violent struggle for African territories' independence. It sent troops to Algeria and Congo under UN banner to maintain peace in these territories torn by Cold War. The Indian government told the Indian population in Africa to support Africans in their fight for independence against colonial administration. African response. The Cold War situation divided the African political leaders. Violence erupted in several African territories against colonial rule. Africans found the position of Indian government on use of violence as a means to win independence, struggle, and looked at the role of Indian troops in Africa. ଭାରତର ସୈନ୍ୟବାହିନୀ ମିଳିତ ଜାତିସଂଘ ଶାନ୍ତି ପିସ୍ କିପିଂ ଫୋର୍ସ ମାନଙ୍କ ସହିତ ଏକତ୍ରିତ ହୋଇ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରରେ ଶାନ୍ତି ରକ୍ଷାରେ ନିୟୋଜିତ ହୋଇଥିଲା। India's anti-colonial image also suffered a blow in Africa because the border problem with Pakistan and China. In contrast, Indians' attitude of passing resolutions condemning violence as undesirable or harmful, the Chinese supported armed struggle of Africans to win independence from colonial control. Next phase was non-alignment. Bhagosthi Nirapeksha Andolan. After 1962, India gave up efforts to cultivate Africa as one collective political bloc, and instead began economic diplomacy with only those African states which stood by during Chinese crisis. Non-alignment became a force for the Indian and African states for fighting common issues of development, decolonialization and disarmament, निरस्त्रीकरण, decolonization ବା ଉପନିବେଶବାଦର ବିଲୋପ at the international forum. In the late 1960s, 1970s, African countries on becoming independent adopted non-alignment. Africa ମହାଦେଶର ବହୁ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ର ଭାରତ ନେତୃତ୍ୱରେ ଏବଂ ଯୁଗୋସ୍ଲୋଭିଆ, ଇଣ୍ଡୋନେସିଆ ନେତୃତ୍ୱରେ ପରିଚାଳିତ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ନିରପେକ୍ଷ ଆନ୍ଦୋଳନରେ ଯୋଗ ଦେଇଥିଲେ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧ ପରବର୍ତ୍ତୀ ବିଶ୍ୱରେ ବା କୋଲ୍ଡ ୱାର ବା ଶୀତଳ ଯୁଦ୍ଧ ସମୟରେ। Relations during the last 3 decades, India's image with African states in the 70s improved through the circumstances at the domestic and a global level, the liberation of Bangladesh and the conclusion of Indo-Soviet Treaty in 1971, underground implosion of nuclear device in 1974, declining Chinese influence in Africa due to ideological quarrels with Soviet Union, and support China gave to South African and CIA support forces in Angola, India's initiative to back various liberation forces in Africa, withdrawal of Indian diplomatic mission from Salisbury 5 months before Ian Smith's UDI Southern Rhodesia, culminated to revive India's image forcibly, अर्थात जो चेंजिंग सिनेरियो सृष्टि है चाइनार इनवॉल्वमेंट इन आफ्रिका महादेशर विभिन्न राष्ट्र रे कमीगला जा फल भारतर संपर्क आफ्रिका महादेशर विभिन्न राष्ट्र सह अधिक स्ट्रेंथेन होता। साउथ साउथ कोऑपरेशन, साउथ साउथ कोऑपरेशन refers to the developing nations discussion by dialogue. Group 7, Group 20, these are the examples of South-South cooperation. विकसित राष्ट्र मानक मध्यरे जो विचार आलोचना करा जाए अर्थनैतिक दृष्टिकोणरू ताहाकू साउथ-साउथ कोऑपरेशन बोली कहा जाए। Performance of the Indian and African states in the post independence period deteriorated. India's border war with Pakistan and China, growing democratic mobilization and the rising expectation offenses impacted the state's performance. While the declaration of internal emergency in 1976 arrested the growth of democratic institutions, traditions, issue-based politics, and secular democratic mobilization was debased by the rise of communal, casteist force, dynasty, and money power in Indian politics. Indian politics, inland politics, internal politics was different in 1980s 80 दशक भारतर आभ्यंतरीण राजनीतिर विभिन्न दिग पाई नकारात्मक घटनावली पाई आफ्रिका महादेशर राष्ट्र सह भारतर संपर्क रे बाधा सृष्टि होइथिला। Political cooperation, while economic cooperation under South-South cooperation failed to take up, India's cooperation in political spheres reached its peak during 1980s. अर्थनैतिक संपर्क सठिक भाव में आगे पारि नथिला बेले दक्षिण सरी आफ्रिका महादेशर राष्ट्र गुड़िक सहित भारतर राजनैतिक संपर्क खूब दृढ़ीभूत होता। कारण नॉन अलाइंड बा गोष्ठी निरपेक्ष आंदोलन रे अधिकांश आफ्रिकार राष्ट्र गुड़िक सदस्यता ग्रहण करी भारतर नेतृत्व को स्वीकार करिथिबारु भारत सहित दक्षिण सरी आफ्रिका महादेशर राष्ट्र गुड़िक सहित संपर्क वृद्धि पाइथिला। इन 21st century India's approach to develop political relationship with African states and African markets was considerably achieved, though some scholars are of the view that South-South cooperation is still possible. The global realities beckon the decision makers to develop new approaches in new century that has just begun. Globalization and interdependence. Global changes have some serious consequences for African and Indian state systems, with the states of former Soviet Union opting for democracy and open market economies. The pressure on the rest of the third world states to embrace the values of open market, liberal economy, and democracy was enormous. The arrangements under WTO World Trade Organization coming into existence, the African and Indian states had to relax their control over economy by privatizing state control-led public sector units. Regional cooperation. African continent has been burdened by inter and intrastate conflicts. एकथा आमे बारंबार पढ़ुचंती जे आफ्रिका महादेशर राष्ट्र समूहरे एथनिक बा सिविल वार एथनिक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट मोर acute तेणु आफ्रिका महादेशर ए समस्या को दूरेଇବା ପାଇଁ ओवरकम କରିବା ପାଇଁ रीजनल कोऑपरेशन बा आंचलिक सहयोग निमंते गुड़ाए अंतर्जातीय संगठन आफ्रिका महादेश भितर ही सृष्टि होइतिला आउ सेगुड़िकर लक्ष्य थिला आफ्रिका महादेश सहित भारतर संपर्क को निबिड़ करिया पे इंडियन डायस्पोरा इन आफ्रिका आफ्रिका महादेश रे थिबा भारतीय मानक संपर्क रे आफ्रिका महादेश रे थिबा भारतीय माने आफ्रिका आउ भारत भितर संपर्क को किभଳି दृढ़ीभूत करूचंती सहयोग करूचंती आगु नेउचंती सेटा इंडिया हैज ए साइजेबल Africa has a sizable Indian community. The Indians are spread over 35 African states. Through large number of them is found in Anglophone East, Central and Southern Africa. They constitute middle-level entrepreneurs and provide skilled manpower for economic growth of these countries. The Indian government has recently introduced several beneficial measures for the Indians abroad with a view to co-opting them in the Indian domestic development and promotion of external trade. India-Africa relation in the 21st century is in cooperation building nature. The 21st century being an age of growing interdependence, the Indian government will be able to utilize the national asset for India's national interest. The growth of regional organizations and the presence of India's in Africa can help Indian trade to penetrate largely into African areas and also help in multiplying the trade between these true these two Indian Ocean territories. भारत महासागर उपकूलवर्ती दुईटी अंचल गोटे होची आफ्रिका महादेश अन्यटी होची भारतीय उपमहादेश इंडियन सब कंटिनेंट उभयक मध्यरे वाणिज्य व्यवसाय ट्रेड एंड कॉमर्स इकोनॉमिक कोऑपरेशन पॉलिटिकल रिलेशन मेंटेन करने क्षेत्र में आफ्रिका महादेश रे थिबा भारतीय मानक अवदान एवं भारत सरकार सेथि प्रति थिबा एटीट्यूड एंड फॉरेन पॉलिसी बहु मात्रा रे सहायक होइछ एक्सरसाइज in this unit there are 5 questions. One is arrival of European powers to the east after 1498 was a watershed in India-Africa relations. ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶ ଉପନିବେଶିକ ଶାସନ ଅଧୀନକୁ 1498 ମସିହାରେ ଯାଇଥିବା ସମୟରେ ଭାରତ ଆଫ୍ରିକାର ସମ୍ପର୍କ ଅଧିକ ଦୃଢୀଭୂତ ହେଇଥିଲା କି? ସେ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ମତ ଲେଖିବା ପାଇଁ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ନମ୍ବର 1. Explain the factors influencing 19th century Indian migration to African colonies. ଊନବିଂଶ ଶତାବ୍ଦୀରେ 19th ସେଞ୍ଚୁରୀରେ ଯେଉଁ ଭାରତୀୟ ମାନେ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶର ବିଭିନ୍ନ ରାଷ୍ଟ୍ରକୁ ଯାଇ ବସବାସ କରିଥିଲେ ତାହା ଭାରତ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ସମ୍ପର୍କ ଦୃଢୀଭୂତ କରିଥିଲା କି? ଅବଦାନ କିଛି ରଖିଥିଲା କି? Question number 3. How did the African experience help Mahatma Gandhi to work for Indian independence? ଏ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନଟା ଅତି ସହଜ, ଜାଣିଛ ଆଗରୁ ମହାତ୍ମା ଗାନ୍ଧୀ ସାଉଥ ଆଫ୍ରିକାରେ ଥିଲାବେଳେ ବର୍ଣ୍ଣ ବୈଷମ୍ୟ ରାସିଆଲିଜିମ ବିରୋଧରେ କିଭଳି ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କରିଥିଲେ ସେହି ଅଭିଜ୍ଞତା ନେଇ ଭାରତରେ ପହଞ୍ଚି ମହାତ୍ମା ଗାନ୍ଧୀ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ଆନ୍ଦୋଳନକୁ ପରିଚାଳନା କିଭଳି କରିଥିଲେ ସେ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ଉତ୍ତର ଲେଖିବା ପାଇଁ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ନମ୍ବର 3 କହୁଛି. Question number 4. Explain the concept of South-South cooperation. Why did South-South economic cooperation between India and Africa fail? କାହିଁକି ଆଗକୁ ଯାଇପାରି ନଥିଲା ଭାରତ ଏବଂ ଆଫ୍ରିକା ମହାଦେଶ ମଧ୍ୟରେ ଅର୍ଥନୈତିକ ସମ୍ପର୍କ? Question number 4. Question number 5. What was India's role in non-aligned forum for supporting frontline African states against South Africa? South Africa. ବୁଝିଲା? ସାଉଥ ଆଫ୍ରିକାରେ ଗୋଷ୍ଠୀ ନିରପେକ୍ଷ ଆନ୍ଦୋଳନ ସମୟରେ ଭାରତ କଣ ସମସ୍ୟାର ସମ୍ମୁଖୀନ ହେଇଥିଲା ସେ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ନମ୍ବର 5 ଲେଖିବା. ବୁଝିଲା? ହ୍ୟାଲୋ?
ହଁ ସାର୍.
5ଟା କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ ଅଛି ଲାଷ୍ଟ ୟୁନିଟରେ. ବହୁତ ସହଜ, କିଛି ଅସୁବିଧା ନାହିଁ. ହେଲା? କମ୍ପ୍ଲିଟ
ହଁ
ହେଲା?
ସାର୍.
ଆଜି କମ୍ପ୍ଲିଟ
ହଁ
ହେଲା?
ସାର୍.
ହଉ,
ଆଜ୍ଞା ସାର୍।
2 ଜଣ ପିଲା ତ ହଁ, ରଖିବା, ଏବେ କ୍ଲୋଜ କରିବା.
ହଁ ହଁ ସାର୍.
ହଉ,
ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ ୟୁ ସାର୍.
thank you very much. Thank you.
କଥା ହେଲ ତା ସାଙ୍ଗରେ
ତା ସାଙ୍ଗରେ
ଏ ଟୋକା ସାଙ୍ଗରେ
ନା ରିସିଭ କରୁନି।
ଜାଣିବେ ରଖିକି ଗଲେଣି पास करते तो कौन करनी है पैसा दे छियो मते बहुत सारे सही ना है मेडिसिन देबे बोले तुमको
ପୁରା ଶଙ୍ଖ ଭବନ
सकवन भीतर डाइटा ना
ସେ ଶଳେ ଆଗରୁ ଛାଡୁ ନଥିଲେ ସାମ୍ବାଦିକଙ୍କୁ ଯାହା କ୍ଷମତା ଗଲା ପରେ ଡାକି କିରି ନଉଛନ୍ତି।